Story points. What a mystical concept. Well, let's deep dive into what they're about and how to use them to do agile estimations, how to teach them to your team, and how to get started with estimations. We're going to cover a couple of things like creating a baseline, just simulating an activity to help them understand the concept, also practicing how to create a baseline. What is planning poker? What are some questions that you should anticipate and some answers that you can give as well? If you like this topic, please hit the like button so it helps with the YouTube algorithm, and remember to subscribe so that you get notified about new videos on the channel. What I'm going to be covering is some science behind the value of estimating as a team versus individuals. And we're going to get a crash course on how to start teaching the concept to your teams. And there's some little tad bits and twists and turns that I'm going to be adding in here that you can choose to use. I would like to reinforce that story points or agile estimations are something that take time and experience to master. And it takes much longer than the length of this video, for example, to really understand and to be able to apply and own. So I'm going to be setting some foundation. I'm going to equip you with a couple of tips and tricks and some facilitation ideas to help with nailing down how to teach estimations to your team. So the way I set up this session for a group of Scrum Masters and Kanban leads that I was training recently was that we jumped right into the activity. And one of the first things to do here is to not tell them anything and just set up the session to say, we're going to talk about story points and estimation, but let's just get started with this activity. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take you through what I did, and of course, bring in your own twists and turns to help nail the concepts down for your team much better. So the way I started was just using simple geometric shapes. And I said, which of these is the least complex to draw by hand? And, we opened up for discussion. We talked about, well, square might be simpler, triangle, maybe it's only 3 sides, less sides than a square. Circle is the most difficult to draw by hand, perhaps. So they started to have a conversation. And all of a sudden, the team asked, well, what tools do we have to draw with? And so I outlined, and you can do anything here to make it easier, more difficult, or change the conversation. As I said, well, you have a piece of paper, simple white sheet of paper, nothing special, and a pencil to draw with. And then I said, any other tools? I said, well, you have a ruler and you have a right angle measure. And so they said, okay, well, we have a right angle measure, we have a ruler, so we know we could do straight lines, we could do right angles really well. And the one shape that has both of those that will work really well is a square. So I said, so then with what I'd like you to do is then come to a decision as a team, as a group here, that square is the simplest. And so some folks were still, well, okay, are we sure we make a triangle? It could be easier, etc. And it turns out that the larger group then agreed upon that based on the tools available and the requirement, the square was the least complex to draw by hand. And so all I did here was that I just dragged a 2, and I said, you guys don't know what this means. It means nothing right now, but I'm just going to put a 2 here just for fun. And the next question I asked them is, well, which is the next least complex to draw by hand? And then now that we have a 2 here, so I'm just gonna copy and paste a little 2 here just to have that in their memory as they have this next conversation. Well, if it's by hand, we have a ruler, we have a right angle ruler as well. Then what is the next least complex to draw by hand? And they said, well, that sounds like the triangle. Okay, so I said, all right, so what I'll do is I'll put a little 5 next to the triangle. Again, this 5 or 2 don't mean anything to you. I'm just going to do that. All right, so what happens now is that we now have a 2 and a 5 here. And I said, well, what about a circle now? And I told them, well, use the scale at the bottom here.
use the scale of these series of numbers to say, okay, now compared to the square and the triangle, how much more or less complex is it to draw a circle by hand with the tools that we have? And they said, well, that's a lot. It's going to be a lot. I said, okay, pick a number. Is it, 10 times more complex than a square, or 20 times or 30 times more complex than a triangle? Any sense of that? They said, well, the highest number on the scale is 100. So I'm just going to give it, we should just going to give it a 100 if we have to compare. So now what you've done as a facilitator is you've created something like a scale. You've created a scale of complexity that tells us that compared to a square, a triangle is about 2.5 times more difficult based on the tools we have, and a circle is definitely, based on a square, 50 times much more complex to draw by hand with the tools we have, and 20 times more than a triangle. Okay, well, I said, and this is a great, good tip. You could start with something more complex or controversial, or less complex or controversial, is up to you. The next shape, I said, all right. So I said, now what I'd like you to do is, with these numbers at the bottom, what I'd like you to do is raise with your hand. So we did this over a virtual Zoom call by hand. So 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13. 20 was just this or this, however it shows, or 40 was this, or 60 was this, and then 100 was just like which is a sense of, okay, it's too big, it's too complex. All right, so you did by hand. You could do this by paper. You can, if people have cards, they can create little cards. You can make it a good fun activity to start off. However you want to do it is up to you, but these are some good tools. This is a good simple technique for you to just get started with a group. So I said, okay, now what I'd like you to do is I'm going to throw up a shape here, and I'd like you to raise, compared to a square or a triangle or a circle, how much more, less, or more complex. So I went with, just start with square and triangle. That's a simple way to get this conversation going. And so the shape I threw up was this one. And they started to have a conversation about, well, that's just a circle, that's just a square, turned in 45 degrees. And how much more or less complex could it be? They said, well, can we turn the paper? And I said, no, you just have to draw that as is. And they said, okay, that's a little more complex. So and they couldn't, the team somehow just could not come to an agreement when I asked them to go 3, 2, 1, raise up your score in terms of complexity on what you think is the complexity of this shape. And so they couldn't, for whatever reason, there was a huge variance between this specific group. In some groups, the conversation might be very simple. In some, it'll be much more complex. And so that's okay. You let that happen. It's the group's way of processing that information, or the team's way to do that. So they couldn't, for whatever reason, they couldn't come to an agreement. So I said, okay, you know what? Let's park this to the side. Let's look at another shape, and let's determine how much more or less complex this is for you to draw by hand. And when they saw the line, they said, oh, that's definitely simpler than a square. So I said, okay, great. If that's the conversation, in 3, 2, 1, what is your number, or your score for where this should be on the scale that you've just created? And they said, oh, that's definitely a 1. It's definitely less complex than a square. And so I said, okay, great, that has a 1. Let's go to another shape, an octagon. It's 8 sides. And they said, okay, well, I said, now let's have a quick discussion. So where does this fall? Well, somewhere between a triangle and a circle is where the discussion went. And then I said, okay, it seems most of you are agreeing on this. Where in 3, 2, 1, where does it fit on the scale? And so they said, this is definitely much more complex. They gave this one a 40. That was a sense of size to say, oh, it's about somewhere in between a triangle and a circle, but it has clear straight lines that can turn into sides, and it still may be easier, more towards the triangle than a circle to draw. I said, okay, what about the star? And in their opinion, when they scored again, so you go again, 3, 2, 1, raise their score. All of them went like this. They said compared to an octagon and a triangle, this is somewhere really up there. This is at least 2 to 2.5 times more complex than an octagon. And so that's a little conversation. Now, some of you may have caught this. That's a little conversation starter right here for you as someone teaching your team how to use story points. Say, okay, so based on the score you have given, this means that to draw by hand a star and a circle are about the same effort and complexity, and that turned the conversation a little bit. They said, well, no, it's still not as difficult as a circle, and it is somewhere in between the octagon and the circle, but it's not as difficult as a circle. We can still draw the straight lines with a ruler. We still have the right tools for it. And so then they changed their estimate unanimously. So I called that again. So 3, 2, 1, and then they put up their score. They changed this score to a 60 to say, well, it's somewhere in between here, so we're going to give it a 60. It doesn't matter. This is not a unit of any kind of time or anything. It's purely complexity in being able to draw this figure. So after they've had that conversation, now I said, well, now you have this rhombus right here that we had deferred for the time being. At the count of 3, 1, 2, 3, go ahead and score where you think it fits in the scale. And so for the most part, at first, the team said, well, definitely between a triangle and an octagon. But then the way to refine this for you as someone facilitating the training is to ask how much more or less. Do you think it's about 4 times? Is it double? Just about triple? Is it about 8 times? Like how much more complex do you think it is from the triangle, or how much less from the octagon? This is a tip. You can choose to throw another wrench in this and say, well, all of a sudden, I find out from somewhere, I as a product owner, that in the company we have a stamp that draws that octagon perfectly for us, and all we need to do is just stamp it onto the piece of paper, and that's the request. I found a stamp. How does that change your estimate in terms of complexity or effort to now draw this octagon? And everyone now rated it a 1 to say this is now easy, just as easy as drawing a line. Some even argued easier than. We said, okay, well, it's the smallest unit, so let's use that on the scale. And so this is a good way to give them a little touch of reality to say there's new information that can come in that will change your estimate. And then it allows them to also look at this as, oh, I would have given this, still 20, 40, 30 hours to draw, versus now it's as simple as a line. And so it takes away some of that confusion that may start to occur around effort being just measured in time versus effort being compared to other units. With this group, I established that there are really 3 big major building blocks for story points. The first is a definition of done. A definition of done is the list in their mind that is clear for everyone, and it's, if you don't have one already, you need to put one in place, and then if you have one already, consider revising it or having a renewed conversation about definition of done, especially if you're now introducing story points to your team as the unit of measure. Second, conversation. So going back to that exercise, one of the ways I connected the exercise to the content is going back to the exercise. Do you think you would have estimated, or you were able to come to these decisions on complexity and effort of all of these items if you hadn't talked to each other about it, or if you hadn't asked me questions around what constraints and what tools you have in place? So this really gives them a taste of, yes, we need to have a conversation about who, what, where, when, why, and then some even about how when we're giving an estimate on any given piece of work we're doing. The last building block that I covered with this team is relative estimation. The third building block, which is very important. So we could also use the word comparative here if that's what resonates for you naturally more, or for the team, for them to really wrap their head around this. There's there is research which I will share in the description below that supports that couple of things. Number one, we are better at estimating as human beings by comparing to something that exists versus in an abstract, absolute form. We're better at doing that. So if I were to give you a headphone, say this one, and give you another head and then just ask you how good is this headphone, you would say, yeah, it's all right, it's good. Like, you're not really sure. But if I gave you 2 headphones or 3 or 10, over comparing them, you would be able to say, you know what, I rank this headphone number 1, the other number 2, number 3, number 4, etc. And so we're, as human beings, are better at comparing things than we are, especially our own experience, than we are at just in absolution saying that something is a certain unit of measure or difficulty, etc. So the importance of having this scale, and your team could easily default into starting to think about story points as hours or days, and they try to convert and create all kinds of mathematical calculations to say, you know, half a story point is 1 day, and then they use that scale to then just say what they wanted to say in the first place. Please defer your teams from doing that. Bring them back to talking about complexity and effort, how much more or less, and comparing to previous experience that they as a team have done some work on, or something that they've established as a baseline, like we did earlier. The 3 shapes we used earlier was now to establish a baseline to say, all right, square is the simplest in the 3 images in front of us. Triangle is the next more complex, and then circle is the most complex. And we established that as a great scale, usually creating 2 to 3 kind of baseline units are really, really useful. And you could do this with your backlog. You could take 3-4 items of varying complexity and size and say, what are the, let's assign these some basic points, and then start to compare and create relative estimates based on those for every item we talk about. Now you've experienced, or you've taken the team towards an experience of how to create a baseline, how to have a conversation about the work items, and then also how to estimate. The next is this for you is, how do we actually do this? So the simulation I went through just now is planning poker, and a lot of you probably recognize that. And so then you want to cover with your team, well, what are what is it that we're doing? And you can start to peel the onion or uncover a few details for them to go through. So planning poker is one of the most common ways to use story points in estimating and with agile teams. And it's actually just a few simple steps. The first thing we do is facilitated by a team facilitator, so a Scrum Master. In this company, they call them Agile Delivery Managers. Kanban leads, I just call them team facilitators as a common term across various different practices. It's good to cover who will estimate, who it puts up a point, who estimates any given piece of work. Well, it's estimated by everybody creating the product. And there's further research, again, covered in the description below, that proves that if all the people doing the work are the best people to inform the estimate on how much work it will take. And so we cannot be doing that if we're not the ones that are building. And if you're someone that is doing the work of building software or building a product, then you're the one that needs to be part of the estimate. So in a common, let's say, software team, this would mean a back-end developer, front-end developer perhaps, tester, analyst, if they're a configurator, network engineer, security engineer, etc., people that have fingers to keys to actually build a product, and they're responsible for creating the product. Additional people that attend a planning poker session or any estimation conversation is a product owner, of course, or a SME, a subject matter expert that is knowledgeable about the business context and the customer's voice, etc. If you can have the customer in the room, that is absolutely great. But a common way to look at this is anybody requesting the work and that can explain what is required is good to have in that conversation before you're estimating. And so estimation is simple. Planning poker is simple, and you go through the 5 steps of planning poker. I took these visuals from Mountain Goat Software. This is Mike Cohen, who has been a very experienced agilist from even before the manifesto, who creates these simple step-by-step guides as well as visuals for you to show your team. So feel free to take them. Link is in the description below as well. You go through the steps. Well, we're all are going to have a card, and this is going to be the scale. We use a modified Fibonacci series for simplicity. If they do ask you why Fibonacci series, well, you can explain that the Fibonacci series is fairly well spaced out. And so as we know about the Fibonacci series, that every number is the sum of the previous 2 numbers before it. And so the series is spaced out enough to be able to get a sense of 2.5 or 10 times or 5 times bigger, etc., or more complex. And so that's why we use Fibonacci series. But this is a good explanation. There's other more detailed explanations that exist for Fibonacci series. I'm happy to provide them in the step 1. Each estimator has a set of cards, those questions and those answers. 2, 1, boop. At the same time, a couple of different things can happen. The first is everyone gives it the same value. Great. Well, that's the estimate. Easy. Then it's, well, what if there's a fairly good variance across all the teams? There could be someone giving a really high estimate compared to the rest of the team, someone giving a really low estimate compared to the rest of the team. Well, you have a simple tool in your hands to solve that problem. You ask them. What is it that feels more complex for you? And they may reveal more information that they may have, or they may really reveal that I am uncertain and I'm not sure of the volume of work here, or the risk or uncertainty, or in general the complexity that we need to deal with. You ask the one giving the lower estimate the same question. What are you thinking? What are questions in your mind? Or what knowledge can you share with the team about this item? And so they may share, well, either, oh no, we already have this solution in place. We just have to make small changes. And so in my opinion, testing this or building this is actually very easy. Or they may say, well, maybe I'm not sure about what is actually required. Can you tell me more? And that is a way to find out, what kind of misunderstandings or gaps in information, or what kind of information exists in the team that is not out in the discussion yet. And so you start to see how important discussion is to this conversation and to this activity of estimating. Well, then you estimate. So then you go 3, 2, 1. All right, guys, after you've clarified some information across each other or asked the product owner or SMEs, 3, 2, 1, pull up your estimate, and then you can rinse and repeat. The goal is to get to consensus. Sometimes you will have an outlier, and the team may agree to say, well, you know what? All of us give this item an 8, and we think it's about 4 times as much as this other item that was a 2. And someone still feels that this is let's say a 20 or something like that. Sometimes it may warrant a discussion, and sometimes it is just they're being risk averse, or they just feel like it's not something that is correctly representing the effort. Well, in that case, the team, I've also seen that the team can actually choose to say, well, just trust us on this one. Let's use this estimate of 8 for now. And if it turns out to be much more than we all thought, then we can use this as a relative point to estimate the next set of items, and that'll help us kind of balance our risk out in the future as well. Well, sometimes what can also happen is the team really can't decide. So you really are seeing that every single person has a completely different view of this one item. That can happen. Or the team may also decide that, we don't know enough to estimate this item yet. Let's go out and get more information. And getting more information can happen in a couple of different ways. The first is, well, let's go back to the client or the requester and understand from them or clarify from them these set of questions we have. The other way of looking at this is to sometimes as a team, you need to go and investigate in your systems or in your product capability to understand if something is doable or what are the risks. And, this may be part of an area you haven't touched before as a team. So what is it that's causing this risk to go up, or this information that needs to be further clarified? So that's a little bit about how to introduce planning poker and some techniques you could be using and agreeing upon as a team to handle, a lack of consensus when it's really varied. Or this is just tips for you as a facilitator to just keep in your back pocket and use as you're facilitating. And then in my case, and this is very useful for you, feel free to screenshot this and add more of your questions or comments. There's some rules we outlined for this set of people that we were training. Is number one, don't equate to hours. And I've mentioned that earlier. Don't take estimates separately from each team member. You're always doing them as a group, and everybody doing the work must be represented present in that group. Avoid estimation inception. Now, this is a term I think I coined, but I don't know, but this is my disclaimer. I may or may not have coined this term. But estimation inception refers to the idea that we need to estimate the effort or work it takes to analyze perhaps something to get it ready for an estimate. So hence the word inception. We don't estimate the work that doesn't provide value or a solution into the client's hands. We only estimate the work that does. And so we avoid estimation inception. This is not about tracking every single hour, every single activity that is being done in the team. This is about how much more or less complex do we think a certain piece of work is, so we can get a sense of what we're committing to. Rule, always discuss first. Discussion is key. If I haven't said that enough, then go back and watch this video again and you will see how many times I've said discuss. Don't estimate bugs, fix them. Simple, truthful. If you want to hold yourself as a team, as a product to a higher standard of quality, then don't ignore the bugs that are coming out of the system. Fix them, because they will create less bugs going forward in production, perhaps, and which means you will have less bugs that are not part of what you're building coming into the system. So any bugs generated, you don't ignore them, you fix them right away. And that's why we don't estimate bugs, because they don't provide value. Something's wrong and you need to fix it. These are estimations, not calculations. Well, these are estimations, not calculations. So this is, again, the sense for the team to understand how much less or more work something might be. But it's not a promise, and it's not a calculation of, okay, this is going to take us 20 hours, so I'm just going to say, 40 points because I said it's half a point is 1 hour or something like that. And so it is not a calculation. It is an estimate, a sense of complexity and effort that might be required to do something. All right. And there are other questions here that I've parked that you can feel free to use and get prepared with more information. I'll have more links in the description so you can look at some great sources of information, but also think about what questions you may have, you may anticipate your team may ask you. And lastly, I'm going to wrap this up by saying, teach your team the concept, understand it yourself about the why. Establish a baseline like the geometric activity I did. There are a couple other ways you could do this. I prefer the shapes. They're simple. They're, at some point, every one of us has drawn a square, a triangle, and a circle in one way, shape, or form or another. And we've done it with different tools, maybe sometimes with a compass, sometimes without a compass in the case of a circle. So you get a sense of the limitations or ease that you may have, right? Discuss one unestimated item at a time. There is a way to do bulk estimations. I won't cover that in this video. I'm going to create another video to really talk about larger high-level estimates. So, stay tuned for that. Like and subscribe for that, and I'd be happy to create it. The next thing is remember to estimate relatively only. Compare it to the work you've done in the past, not in isolation or absolution. Compare it to experience the team has had doing some work that you want to estimate against. Next, execute the sprint and measure velocity. So now shifting from hours to story points, you're going to measure velocity in story points. How many story points did we cover in our sprint? And that will give you a sense of how much to commit to every sprint, but also it'll give you a sense of, where is it that we can start to see our stable team performance starting to happen, and how many story points do we, are we full capacity and we're able to manage it and complete it, 80 to 90% of the time. And so continue doing that. After that, just repeat steps 3 and 4. Now check out these videos for more Agile related content.